Hi and welcome to a video which is all about applying for computer science at university in the UK, because there are quite a few steps involved and quite a lot to know, and it's something you only go through once, at least as a student, and so as much information as you can get I think is really useful. So I'm a teacher, I teach A-level computer science, and so I have lots of students every year go to do computer science university. Last year all but one went to do it or do something very similar to it. One did games design, I think. I've also got a video which is much more about what it's like when you're at university. So if you're not quite sure if you want to do computer science, or if you are sure and want to know more about what it's actually like, check out my other video which I'll link below. And that covers what you do once you're there. But this video is what you do before you get there. So what do you have to do in order to get there? Now, the timeline here is based on you being 17, 18 when you are doing this application, and you being in a sixth form or a college. Of course, you can apply to university when you're an adult, you can apply further down the line, you can have a gap year, and so these timings may change, but I'm assuming most of you watching are maybe in year 12, in year 13, and so this timeline will hopefully apply. So the activity tends to start in earnest in year 12. I found, at least in my school, when I was in school, it started around sort of June or July of year 12. You might start a little bit earlier, you might start to think about it a little bit early, you might speak to your family about it earlier, but that's when it tends to kick in school. Because often there'll be some mock exams, which might be used to generate your predicted grades, and people often get quite agitated about this, which is understandable, because as we'll look at, the predicted grades really are quite important for your applications. But that will happen then. The school generally might start to ramp up in terms of their uni talk, as I would describe it. Things like assemblies, talking about it in your tutor time, talking about it in the corridors with your friends. There's sort of more discussion about it, which can be a bit maybe anxiety inducing. And also I think if you're not keen on going to university, it can get a bit wearing. But there we go. And one thing we'll talk a bit about later is open days. These often tend to happen around June or July. Because the university is emptier, most of the students have left for their summer, and it looks nice, it's usually warm. Open days do continue throughout sort of the autumn, but I would generally recommend, as we'll talk about, going in the summer. And also at this time of year, potentially teachers might start writing references. I certainly wrote my current year 13's references back in June, July, so quite a long time before they actually applied. That's worth thinking about if you need to drop in into conversation any things you want to have mentioned or anything like that. It can be quite tricky as a teacher writing, I think I wrote 40 references last year, a lot are quite similar, so if you can give the teacher some ideas, that can be actually quite helpful. Now the summer itself, of course you want to relax after a busy year 12, but it's a good opportunity to not only think some more about university and your application, especially if you're aiming very high, and we'll talk Oxbridge a bit later, but your personal statement needs to include ideally some relevant experience, some relevant reading maybe, some things about the subject you enjoy, and so it's a good chance to do some of that stuff. I've called it padding quite cynically, but obviously it should be useful to you. But it's a nice chunk of time where you can read around the subject, or watch some relevant videos, or try a little project, whereas doing that in a weekend right before you submit your application is not ideal. Now, year 13 is of course where a lot of the action happens. It's a very busy year because it's the last year in school. So in September, there might be some more open days. I would generally avoid these because it sounds silly, but it's a bit darker, it's a bit wetter, you're focusing on your year 13 content. So if you can do that in the summer, that's better. And kind of at this time, it's where the school are going to put some more pressure on you to finish your personal statements, and also references will get finished, and possibly any tweaks to your predicted grades based on other assessments or based on persuasion in some cases. That might happen at this point too. Now October is when currently the deadline for people applying to Oxford and Cambridge is, so you have to apply to all 5 in October if you want to apply to either Oxford or Cambridge. That's done early because there are interviews, but for the majority of people they will apply in January. Currently it's actually quite late January, in the past it's been a little bit earlier, but that's when most other people will actually submit their full application. And then after this, it depends the actual timings based on a few things, but offers will hopefully start coming through. It took me I think the first one took maybe a few weeks, and then the latest one was like a few months after I submitted the application. There might be some follow-up visits, which I'll mention a little bit later, and also there'll be a deadline where you've actually got to choose your firm choice and your insurance choice, which again we'll come back to. That reply deadline is often quite late in the year, so making that choice, I think, as early as possible is a good thing to do. Now, after year 13, you've got your exams. Now, the exams become really, really important. I think a concern is year 13 can be very much uni prep, other distractions like driving tests, etc. But actually, you're there to do your A-levels or your BTECs, whatever you're doing. That's really important. But once they are done, and hopefully you've done as well as you could, in mid-August, there'll be results day, where you know your grades, and that's really where stuff starts to kick in. So if things haven't gone quite as well as you wanted, or they've gone better than you wanted, there are options like clearing, where maybe you find another university who will give you an offer, and once you have got an offer accepted and confirmed and it's all done and dusted, there'll be various admin the union will get you to do, things like choosing your accommodation, gathering your details, giving you loads of stuff about the first few days and weeks, because usually in either late September or early October, the actual university year begins, so it is a very long summer, which you need to savour if you can. The first week is usually moving in and not much happens, maybe a few general lectures. That's called Freshers Week, so a lot of it is spent partying if you're that way inclined. And the second week is where stuff kicks in and the university begins, and that's outside the scope of this video. So, this is a typical timeline for, like I say, people who are in year 12, year 13 in school. A little bit different if you are a bit older or are doing a gap year, but that is the general process. And we're going to talk about each step as we go through. Now, just a tiny bit more of a process. As you probably know, the system the UK uses is called UCAS. It's an organisation who basically manage the application process. It's probably a good thing UCAS are there, because it would be a nightmare if every university had a different system. It means every person does the same form and does the same application format. Now, you are allowed to apply up to 5 universities at a time. You don't have to, but you can apply up to 5. And the deadlines I showed before, especially the kind of hard deadlines in October and January, are set by UCAS. So, in terms of computer science across all of the universities in the UK, this is just a picture showing some, there are loads more. They're going to have fairly similar content, and I talked more about what the content is like in my other video, but they might vary in a few things, okay? They'll be fairly similar though if they are registered with the BCS. This is the organisation which standardises lots of things related to computer science in the UK. So if you see that mentioned in prospectuses, that's what that means. Anyway, variations come into things like how practical the course is, whether you've got mostly coursework, mostly exams, the amount of contact time you have. Generally, the wealthy universities will have more time where you are sat in front of a lecturer, you've got drop-in sessions, you've got labs, etc. How good the facilities are. Open days are quite important for this because anyone can show a picture of a nice looking computer room. You want to have good systems to use. You don't want to be in a miserable, dark, mouldy room, which I've seen before. Now, the department faculty are people who are teaching you, people who are marking your work, usually they're doctors or professors. It takes a lot of work to become a doctor or a professor, but still, expertise can vary. They might be very strong in one particular field of computer science. Equally, they might be quite inexperienced. You might get taught sometimes by people doing their PhDs, which can be good, can be a sign that actually they find it hard to recruit people sometimes. And that will be linked to their reputation, how they're seen by groups like employers, and also the rigour of assessment. Some, just half the course seem to get firsts for highest grade, and other universities it's much more difficult, and so getting a first would be more impressive to employers. These are all things to weigh up and all things to think about, and we'll go through aspects of how you would weigh that up. Another thing to consider is the fact that there won't always be pure computer science degrees. Most universities do have a computer science degree called computer science, but there'll be some CS variant degrees dotted about as well. These are things like cybersecurity, games development, machine learning, IT, etc. Things which are related but could be a bit different to what you are expecting. So make sure you investigate these most thoroughly if you are considering something not labelled computer science but really want to do computer science. One aspect which will help you evaluate universities, at least as an initial filter maybe, are rankings. So there are a few different league tables for universities, either in the UK or in the world in some cases. These are not official, they're not by a government, they are by often newspapers who publish these league tables every year based on metrics they choose. So they'll find a way to get some data on the universities and somehow aggregate it into an overall score, and they'll rank the universities based on this score. So it's not always the most transparent. You don't always know exactly where they're getting the numbers from. Some that even have numbers, and so you're kind of thinking, well, what if they were terrible and they're just assuming they're good? So these are not definitive, as we'll look at, but it does give you a useful guide. So currently St Andrews, Oxford, Cambridge are the top three. Yeah, I would say they probably are the top three, right? It's not particularly controversial. You can often filter by subject. This one at the top is just for every subject. So you can see for computer science, the top 5 is a tiny bit different. So we're losing LSE, which is not really focused on the sciences, which makes sense. But the order might be a little bit different. There are some different numbers. I think it's good to look at the second table because different subjects may not be equal within one university. For example, my university was number 1, I think, in the world for something quite narrow, like I want to say hospitality or something like that. And so people would flock from all over the world to do hospitality at my university because it was top in the world. Whereas computer science wasn't top in the world, unfortunately. And so there is variation within subjects in the university, which is worth thinking about. Now, the league tables, because they're different, they use different metrics and they're different organisations and they might have biases, they don't always agree, and they can definitely fluctuate quite a lot year on year. So my university, when I applied for it, it was in the top 10, I want to say. I can't verify this years down the line, but I'm fairly sure it was in the top 10. And as soon as I went there, it nosedived. I think it was in like the top 50 by the time I left, which maybe that was my fault, I'm not quite sure. But when I was there, it seemed to get better over time. They were doing lots of building work, new lecturers came in who were quite good. So it was a bit weird attending it and thinking, well, hang on, things are getting better, or so it seems, and yet the ranking is going down. So, it's not something you want to overthink. I do think they're a good guide, especially if all of them roughly agree, but they don't always agree. So, for example, just a university, I won't name it, you can probably find out if you're desperate, is currently ranked slightly differently in 2 different league tables. So it's 13th according to the Complete University Guide and 16th according to the Guardian in all of their subjects. Now that is a difference which I think is very insignificant. They're very similar. That's not a huge difference, right? I wouldn't think too much about 3 places. But for computer science, there does seem to be quite a big disagreement between the 2 on how it sits. So 11th in the country is quite different to the 33rd in the country. It's not a deal breaker, but that's quite a big difference. And it's the same year, the same university, the same course, just based on slightly different metrics. And you might want to investigate this if you do find one of your choices has got a slightly weird ranking for some reason. My 2-minute research into this seems to suggest that maybe the Guardian doesn't take into account research as much as the Complete University Guide. So this university supposedly has quite good research, but the Guardian didn't seem to take that into account. But then the Guardian had lots of columns on things like satisfaction and employment, which didn't seem to be reflected as much in the other one. So that maybe explains why this is a little bit lower. But whether you agree or not might depend on your view on how they approach things. Anyway, I guess my whole message here is it's fine to use the rankings as a guide. If a university is ranked 150th in the country, well, if you're looking at some which are top 10, that is a huge difference. But if you're looking at one which is 17th and another one is 21st, and you like the 21st one, that's a minor difference. It's not worth obsessing over. And the rankings are not static. They definitely will change, especially outside of the top 5, the top 10. Now, there are also other groups which might link to rankings, at least in terms of public perception. Things like the Russell Group, which has, I think, about 25 or so universities. This is a self-selected group, so the universities weren't chosen based on merit necessarily. They just sort of decided to be known as the Russell Group. But they are some good universities, and these ones do have good reputations, but it's not a guarantee of quality. I wouldn't only look at the Russell Group universities because there are some really, really good ones which just weren't chosen as part of that group or didn't want to be part of that group. So while employers will like to see Russell Group universities, and schools will talk about it quite a lot, actually don't restrict yourself to just those limited universities. Now, okay, let's start to talk about some of the factors involved in this application process. So what are universities looking for? Because you don't just walk up to Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, Edinburgh, and they let you in straight away, right? They are selecting you as much as you are selecting them. Well, they're looking for grades. I think the honest answer is grades are their main criteria. If you are an incredible, well-rounded, amazing person, but your grades aren't what they want, not much chance of you getting in, I'm afraid. So this table shows 6 universities and their current entry requirements. Some offered a range, and I've just picked the higher end of this range, but here's what they are today. Of course, this may change and it's just meant to be a guide. Now, it's a kind of causal relationship here between how good the university is, I say good kind of in quotes there, and how high the requirements are, because someone who's getting A star, A is going to be very, very strong, and so is going to produce very, very good work, and so the university gets better. But equally, a really good university can afford to attract the strongest candidates because they can afford to filter so much. So it's kind of a two-way relationship here a little bit. Some universities really aim high with their requirements, so you'll find actually sort of between 1 and 15, there'll be universities which have entry requirements similar to the top couple. You'll notice that. But yes, I think the main thing to point out is many of the top ones, the top sort of 15, 20, do need A-level maths, and even just below it, they really want decent maths. Having said that, if that's an issue for you, a lot of universities, maybe not the top 5 or so, but a lot of universities do offer slight variant degrees where maybe you do some business instead of a maths module. My university made a big deal of you having A-level maths for computer science, but I rocked up to the first lecture and half the people around you are not doing computer science, they're doing computing and IT, which didn't need maths to get in. So you might have to hunt around the website to see if there are alternatives if maths isn't what you have and you want to aim for those. The very top ones, and we'll talk Oxbridge a bit more later, really further maths I think is encouraged, but you sort of need to have it, I would say. One thing you might notice not being here is any reference to A-level computer science, and I'm not aware of any universities which need you to have A-level computer science. I've seen a couple which say something along the lines of, you need to get ABB, but the A must be in either maths or computer science. So they might kind of have it there somewhere, but not as a, you must have this or you can't apply. I think mostly because despite us growing as a subject, unfortunately it's still not offered in every sixth form college. It's quite a specialist subject at school, so you don't need it basically. If you have it, great, you've got knowledge of what the course is going to be like, you've got stuff to write about in your personal statement maybe. But if you haven't got it, it's not a problem. They won't assume you've got it when you start at university. Just towards the bottom end, I've put CCC. At the bottom end, often they do it in terms of UCAS points because you may have things like BTECs, CTECs, which are equally valid as A-levels, and so they won't always say CCC because that's a different grading scheme to the vocational qualifications. In the past, these have been very fixed. If you've got an offer for A star AA and you get A star AB, you're not going in. That's how it's been in the past. Nowadays, even the offers are a bit more flexible at times. There are contextual offers for various groups of people. Maybe if your school is not traditionally sending people to university, you might have a lower offer. And also, they often offer ranges, especially at sort of towards the bottom end. It may say CCC, but if you've got a good personal statement and you ring up and you're keen, they might reduce that. They might even give you an unconditional offer. I know somebody who the university says you need to get CCC, and they gave this person an unconditional one. Unfortunately, that meant they gave up a little bit, but somehow they managed to get that. Despite grades being important, they're not the only thing in life, of course, but also with these applications. So your experience, which will be limited, of course, at this level, your passion and also soft skills will be important. Soft skills are things like communication, teamwork, things which not everybody has, basically. Now, the grades will be evidence from your predicted grades. They may look at your GCSEs, but I think that's relatively unlikely. It's mostly just what do the school think you're going to get. Whereas you've got more control over the other stuff, so your personal statement can guide them towards evidence of your passion and any skills you might have, and also the reference from your teacher or your tutor or whoever it will be may also provide that as well. Now, whether you can see that or not will vary based on the school. I never got to saw my reference, or I only ever saw snippets of it. And my school, I don't think we share references either. So, but you might be able to get a sense, right? You might be able to speak to a teacher and guide them. Like I said a bit earlier, it can be hard as a teacher to write 30, 40, 50 references, which are different and are honest and cover everything and are really positive. So speaking to your teacher, if you've got that relationship, would be useful, I would say. Okay, so that is what universities are looking for. In terms of what maybe you are looking for, which is also as important, if not more important. Well, first of all, ideally fairly early on in the process, ideally maybe sort of midway through year 12, towards the end of year 12, think about what is both an ambitious set of universities, but also realistic, but also attainable for you. Now, initially I wrote down what is realistic for you, but that's a bit negative. I think it is important to aim high and to try and think, what could you realistically achieve here? But it has got to be realistic. If you've got a D in your mock exams at the end of year 12 and you're thinking about Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, St Andrews, well, that is a big, big jump. Whereas if you're getting an A in your end of year 12 mock and you wanted to get an A star maybe and you were close, 100% think about those top ones. Don't get put off thinking you might not be quite good enough or someone else is better than you. We want to be ambitious for yourselves, especially because you've got 5 options and 5 potential offers, but it needs to be grounded. If your teacher's predicting you a C and you are sure you can get an A, well, you've got to have that conversation with your teacher to try and figure out why. Because if your predicted grade is a C, that's going to eliminate you from the universities which want an A. So there has got to be some realism here, and I think that can be a bit hurtful for some people sometimes, feeling that they're not being predicted a grade they deserve. I think in the vast majority of cases, teachers are being ambitious for their predicted grades, sometimes too much actually. So it's a difficult one and it's a difficult balance, but it's something you've got to think carefully about and use things like mocks and your assessments as a guide, because you don't want to aim too high and not even reach a midpoint. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a bit of a difficult one, of course. It's slightly more easy, well maybe not easy, but slightly more less contentious question to ask yourself is, what kind of experience are you looking for? So this might include things like, do you want to go to a campus university and have it all in one place? Do you want to have it in a city where you're more spread out and it's maybe less of a university bubble maybe? If you don't know what those two things are, or how they're different, go and visit one of each type of university. You might be lucky to have a situation where you can live at home. Personally, I could have lived at home, but I would have found it very, very difficult. But I didn't want to live miles and miles away. I wanted to live at a distance which I could come home if I wanted to, but that's something you've got to think about. Do you want to do a 7-hour train journey to go home and visit? Well, you might want to be far away, but equally that might be a bit difficult. Many universities offer what's called a sandwich course, where usually between your second and final year, you can do a year working in industry or a year studying abroad. Not all universities do offer these, and so you should think about it. I'm not aware of any which force you to do this, but there might be some which do, and so that's something you've got to think about. Likewise, some degrees are sold as having an integrated master's. A master's is usually 1-year degree you do after your initial, say, 3-year degree. Your first degree is called your bachelor's degree. Some sell it as one big package, which again, you might not be forced to do all 4 years, but equally that might be the expectation. But it's worth thinking about, worth researching. Other factors are things like how big the cohort is. Some have only got 30, 40 people, whereas some have got 250 people. And that may be hard to glean from a website, but you can speak to people at open days and find out how big it is. There's pros and cons of the size, I would say. And there are other factors like sports, clubs, whether you want to work, whether you've got friends who live nearby, family who live nearby. There's other factors, right? So you've got to think about it and try and weigh up your options as you go and visit, as you do some research. And my final question is maybe a little bit abrupt, but is important. Do you definitely want to do computer science? It's worth thinking about really carefully. Some people just go with the flow a little bit, follow, their older sister or their friend or an uncle who did it before. they just pick one because it sounds like it's interesting, sounds like it's popular. They're not even sure if they want to go to university. Really important to think about it. Of course, I think it's fantastic and I'd obviously recommend it, but it's maybe not for everyone, and you've got to be in the right frame of mind to go through all of the applications and to go through the 3 or 4 years it might take. For questions 1 and 2, and potentially question 3 as well, you can weigh these up at open days. Open days are events the university holds. Usually they do several a year, and they're aimed solely at prospective students. So they put on loads of events, expect thousands of people to turn up in most cases, and they can get quite busy and they can be quite hectic. I found them quite draining personally. Now, one thing I learned the hard way was you have got to book these in advance most cases. You can't just show up. These can go quite quickly and fill up quite quickly. There were a few which I was wanting to go to because they were on school days and I was too late and had to go at weekends instead, which was a bit of a shame. Often schools do allow you to have maybe only 2 or 3 days off to visit open days, but there might all be some Saturdays you've got to go to as well. The way these work might vary a little bit actually, but the general things are what you'd expect really. Might be some guided tours. Again, you might have to sign up or queue for these. There'll be some lecturers and other activities available in the particular department areas. You know, if you're really keen on doing computer science, you probably won't go and visit medicine and maths and engineering unless you are thinking about those two. But you might be able to chat to a lecturer or some students. Activities might be just someone programming, like it's not that exciting in computer science really. You might have a chance, and hopefully you would, to have a look at some halls of residence where you might live in your first year. I talk about these in my other video quite a lot. And also there'll be stalls with ambassadors to speak to and so on. They are quite busy, is my experience. Now, it's a difficult one because you've got up to 5 choices. 5 open days is quite a lot, and quite a lot of time, quite a lot of energy. If they're quite far away, it's quite a lot of effort to go to. But my tip would be to definitely visit all of them that you're thinking of applying to. Doesn't necessarily just have to be open days, because you might just be able to book a one-off visit. With a friend of mine, we went to a London university and we just emailed the office and was like, can we come and visit? And they said yes, and essentially me and this one other boy just were given a tour of the department on our own. We got given, the prospectus and some goodies like you would an open day, but it wasn't an open day and it was quiet and it was nice. So there might be a possibility. And also for many of them, you can just turn up and have a look around. You might be able to go inside the buildings, but you could ask, but you could wander around and see what the actual area is like maybe. But also, if you were a bit of a gambler, you could apply to some, and they might well invite you to applicant days or offer holder days where they do maybe a more detailed tour. I think many of the sort of like top 20 universities do these applicant and offer holder days because they're desperate for you to make them your firm choice when there's quite a lot of competition potentially. But that might be a little bit more personalised and less busy. I went to a couple of those and they were quite good, I thought. Another tip, which may not be possible depending on your situation, is to mix up who you are going to these visits with. You could go on your own. I never did for some reason. In hindsight, I probably should have done it. It would have been a bit easier, but that takes some bravery, I think. Going with your parents might be useful. I think towards the end I was a little bit wound up when I did that. Go with a friend if they've got the same rough interest and the same rough aspiration with you. I did that once and it was much better, I would say, but it was just an off chance that we were looking at the same university and we had a similar interest. And also, if you can, pre-plan as much as you are able to. So if you look at the website and you've got a few key questions, you've got a few key areas you want to visit, maybe there's a gym or a particular halls of residence you want to have a look at, maybe there's somewhere you can go for lunch in the town that you want to plan. I think it just makes it easier. A few times I was sort of dragged by my dad to go to one of these and I had no idea what I was looking at. I was just sort of wandering around aimlessly and it was a little bit pointless. So planning is difficult, of course, but it's worth thinking about. And also something I didn't do, and so I can't show you any, is take some photos. Don't do this too invasive, but if there's an impressive lab or you want to have a look at the room or you want to have a look at a photo of a lecture theatre, it might be useful for your later reference, because when you are actually finalising your application, when you are maybe getting offers and you've got to think about which one you want to go to, having a reference might be useful because you'll quickly forget and they'll quickly blur together. Now, one of the main things which you can control fully about your application is your personal statement, because you are the person writing this, whereas your reference you can only control to an extent, your grades you can only control to an extent, at least in terms of your predicted ones. But this is really down to you. Now, this is really setting out why you want to join the university and what you offer them. Now, because you're applying to, say, 5 in one go, it's not tied specifically to that university. It's one general statement aimed at all 5, ideally. And it's got a limit. It can only be 4,000 characters, which for me was only one side of A4, maybe a little bit less actually. So this will be read by an admissions tutor who may well be an academic at the university. That was what I experienced when I applied to mine. It was read by, a doctor in the department who was a lecturer, but equally it might be done by somebody else, I'm not quite sure. Now, I don't really know how much detail they look at these in. I don't know how thoroughly they're reading it. I'm sure they get loads and loads and loads. I think the importance of this varies a little bit. This is my one, by the way. I've blacked out a couple of more personal bits, but I'll talk more about mine a bit later. But I think as long as it's written fairly well and it's fairly clear and it's fairly relevant and there's nothing in there which is really weird, I think for most universities it will not be that important. But if you're wanting to get a slight reduction in your offer, or if you're doing something really, really competitive, this could make the difference. And so making this as strong as you can is important, but equally, it's probably not the most important factor when you look at your predicted grades. Again, if your predicted grades are much lower than the university you want to go to is asking for, this may not make a difference, I'm afraid. But happily, we are now apparently the fastest growing degree subject. There were 25,000 people studying it this year, which is a good thing. It shows it's a popular subject, but obviously that increases the competitiveness of these applications. Okay, so this is my personal statement. You can read it and pause if you want to. I'm not saying it's a perfect one. Here is a photo of the folder I managed to dig out on my computer where I wrote personal statements. I promise this is a legitimate screenshot. I haven't done this just for this video. You can see, I don't know if it's messy or organized. I'm not quite sure how to classify this, but it takes a few goes. Lots of versions, lots of finals in the title, lots of edits. That's how it goes. So you're not going to get it first try. You can't do it in an afternoon, or you shouldn't, I would suggest. And before you start writing, make a plan. Your first draft will be quite weak and quite waffly, I would suggest, but having a plan before you start is important. I don't really remember what I did. I found this at the bottom of one of these older documents where I've just sort of listed a bunch of random things. I'm not quite sure if I wrote this or a family member did on my behalf. I'm not quite sure. Probably I did actually, but that was my planning as far as I can tell. You might be able to do something a bit better, a mind map and so on. Doing a plan before maybe the summer holidays between year 12 and 13 is probably the ideal time to do it. So if you are thinking, oh my goodness, there's not much to write about, you've got time to go and read a few books or do a few projects maybe. So once you are doing this process, like I say, you should not be doing it in an afternoon. You should be getting some feedback, getting some people to proofread it. So family members, friends, maybe if you're feeling brave. Your teachers might be happy to look at it. I'm sure they would be if you're very polite about it, and get some feedback. Here are some comments I found, not anything particularly useful. Somebody went through and made loads of stuff italic, which I don't think UCAS allowed, so it was a bit of a waste of time. But you'll get some suggestions. If you're having to cut down your writing to fit the 4,000 characters limit, which I had to do, getting some help with that is useful because sometimes you hit a brick wall and you can't cut it down anymore. So I'm not an expert because I'm not an admissions tutor, but I have looked at lots of personal statements in my time, some good, some average, and some which just read really badly. So here are some of my opinions. These are opinions, so take it like that. First of all, I think focus on the things you have done. Don't hedge your bets. Don't be a bit modest, maybe. Don't focus on the team too much. So for example, instead of saying, in a recent economics team project, we had to pitch to, etc., etc., make it so that it's obvious that it was you doing the pitching, because they care about you, not about some other people they don't know. Try and keep it subject specific, but not tied to one particular university or course. Most computer science degrees are quite similar, and so it's hard to make it too close to one particular course unless you name drop it. But if you are applying to a few similar courses, be careful to keep it generic and so that it applies to all. Some people might apply to a couple of maths courses and a couple of computer science courses, which is difficult to write about, but you obviously pick out the common bits between the two if you can. Also, as the whole point of this is, right, to pick out experience that you've done. To be clear, you don't need to have any experience of computer science specifically. You don't have to turn up being an amazing programmer, but showing you've done something relevant, even if it's only relevant to the skills involved, is what they're going to be looking for. So don't just pick it out, but also explain how it is relevant. You know, if you write about the fact that you've done a Duke of Edinburgh Bronze Award, which I did, well, fine, but what does that mean? You walked around in a field for a little bit. Well, of course, you can spin it into being more useful, say which required resilience and all this sort of stuff, right? You can spin it a little bit to make it clear why that is relevant. Whether that's the best example to use, I'm not quite sure, but you may be desperate, I don't know. In terms of the don'ts, don't use cliches or stereotypes about the subject. So, for example, saying something like, while lots of computer scientists are obsessed with gaming or building computers, I actually prefer something else about the subject. I've definitely read similar stuff to that, maybe even more offensive, where they're talking about actual stereotypes and how they don't match those stereotypes. You've got to bear in mind, the person reading it is likely going to be a computer scientist who knows so much more than you do, and so you've got to be a little bit careful not to offend or sound too arrogant. Likewise, don't state the complete obvious or try and explain stuff about the subject, because you are not an expert at 17 or 18 compared to, in particular, the people who are going to be reading this potentially. So it's very easy to drift into statements like, technology is becoming increasingly relevant in our modern world, etc., etc. I imagine a fair few personal statements start with a sentence like that. It doesn't add anything. The person reading it knows this. Everyone knows this. It's not a good reason to be right. It's not a good thing to write about, even if that's a true fact. Likewise, if you're explaining something, making it too textbooky, that's not relevant either. So if you've been learning object-oriented programming, great, but then you start to explain what that is, unless you're adding something about your skills and your interests and your takeaways, it's not really relevant. And finally, don't make any bold claims. I said not to be too modest, but equally you can be too arrogant and kind of say stuff like, I excelled at Android app development. Well, again, you're 17, 18, you probably didn't excel at it, or at least they can't tell that from reading it. So be a little bit modest. Don't try and shout about your achievements, but don't be too obnoxious, I would say. That might be hard for you to tell if you're crossing that line. So if you can get somebody honest to read it and give you feedback, that would be helpful. Looking more at mine, which I don't want to look at in loads of detail because mine is not incredible. It's not bad. I think it's decent. I spent a lot of time writing it and got lots of feedback. The top is my first draft, or a paragraph of my first draft. And the bottom bit is the same paragraph, but in the final version. My first draft was 6,000 characters, if not more. And so I had to cut that down, which was quite tricky. And it wasn't really my skill because my writing is quite waffly, as you might have got the sense already. So I kind of cut it down quite a lot, cut out a few kind of nonsense sentences. You know, this last sentence doesn't add anything really. And so that just goes. You kind of tighten up a little bit. So you can pause and read if you want to. I think my thinking here was sort of to show my wider reading, and also I think I wanted to sound really clever by mentioning quantum computers, because back when I wrote this, these were in the news quite a lot. In the years subsequent, they haven't really taken off particularly much, but I thought they would. So that was me dropping that into my personal statement. So here's my whole personal statement if you want to have a read. Nothing incredible, of course. I've covered up a few bits which were a little bit personal. Nothing like a sob story, which I don't think is really appropriate for this, even if you had one. But they were specific to me, so I didn't really want to publish those. The rest of it could apply to anyone, quite honestly. Nothing here was particularly unique to me, apart from maybe a couple of things which were blanked out. So I didn't really plan this specifically, but the structure I kind of fell into was this. A short intro. Whether that's a good intro or not, I'm not quite sure. Then talking about your connection to the subject. Why did I pick computer science? Why did I like it? Try to give a couple of reasons, how convincing they are. You can judge for yourself. Then I had a fair bit on just relevant subject activities, things I've done which were connected to the subject. Obviously you can't see some of it, but things like volunteering, things like some reading, which are relevant to the subject. And the final one was trying to be a little bit broader. What do I want to do in the future? What other things do I like? Now, some of this now, I've got to say, reading it is very cringy, and I'm sure no matter how good your personal statement is, 5-10 years down the line, it might be a little bit cringy too. That's kind of how this is. So don't judge me too heavily. I don't judge myself too heavily here, but some lines are a little bit much, I think, in hindsight. So if I was to kind of critique my personal statement here, even better if, well, I think first of all, the intro, it's difficult writing an intro because you don't want it to be too boring, but it's quite an abrupt intro. You know, studying GCSE was a challenge, there are some teaching issues, etc., etc. Bit negative maybe I could have reframed that a tiny bit by flipping this round a little bit, potentially. There are a few quite pretentious lines which again make me cringe. Things like, I mentioned, I began delving into university textbooks, computer science and overview, a favourite. A little bit cringe. It doesn't quite ring true. It's not quite what I was like at 17, 18, but I wanted to sound probably smarter than I was. So they might question whether that's a realistic thing to say. And also my big paragraph about quantum computing, especially in hindsight, doesn't seem that relevant. How many of universities I applied to actually had any connection to this? None, I think, basically. But again, I was trying to sound a little bit smarter than I was maybe. But I don't think that's a terrible mistake. It is an area of interest. It is connected to computer science, of course. So I think, yeah, mine's not perfect, but I think it's not a terrible example to have a look at to get some ideas. And I didn't do anything special here. Nothing here was particularly impressive on its own. I just tried to spin it and try and pad it out over many drafts. Just to give you some further ideas if you're really stuck, what you could write about or what you could do to prepare yourself to include in your personal statement. Well, reading books, there are some good ones here, 3 examples, but have a look on Amazon, look at some recommendations, go to a library if you want to pick one which looks interesting and you might be able to explore further, ideally. Maybe you read a book on cryptography and you do a little project based on it and you talk about it. That could be a paragraph in your personal statement. Other little projects, maybe doing some hardware stuff. You know, building a gaming computer is not that relevant, but if you talked a lot about how you optimized it or you fixed some errors or you tampered with something to make it better, etc., maybe making a website app or something like that. Again, you don't have to do any of this, right? And they're not expecting you to walk in with knowledge of any of this, but I think you've got to write about something in your personal statement, and this shows you've taken things seriously and you need to know a little bit about the subject. And it's good for you. You know, you might find that actually you sit down and read a book about algorithms and you find it so boring and so irrelevant, and that might be a sign that actually computer science is not really for you. Other things I would recommend are, some select stuff on TV or movies. I wouldn't write about a film for your whole personal statement, but watching it might give you some more ideas and give you some more basis to research. Some good podcasts on things like Radio 4 in our time is good about loads of academic subjects, but there are some good episodes on computing. And BBC4, if you go on iPlayer, has usually got a fairly big archive of loads of documentaries. Some are better than others, and some have got no relevance to technology, but there are usually at one time a few which are related. And a few other just standalone ideas are things like finding some competitions. You haven't got to win, but a maths competition they would like, a coding competition they would like, a security testing competition would be good on a personal statement. Maybe there's some research you can do into a particular topic. You might do an EPQ on a particular computing topic which you can write about. A good easy win, especially if you want to get a good reference, is doing some volunteering. You probably got to do this in year 12, maybe fairly early in year 12, but you could help out in a GCSE class or a Key Stage 3 class maybe, or do a club at school. Doing some visits to museums or other important sites with computing. And if you can, can be hard depending on your connections or depending on the school's connections, but getting some work experience at a somehow loosely related tech company would be good. So you wouldn't be able to cram all of these into one personal statement, and some of these on their own wouldn't be particularly strong, but you've got to start somewhere, and the summer of year 12 into year 13 is a good chance to do some of these. Let's talk Oxbridge for a little bit, and you may want to skip if you've got no interest in this, because really this only really applies to a very small number of people in the UK. I mentioned 25,000 people do computer science, and probably less than 1,000 should even consider Oxbridge in all truth, right? If you're not going to get A star, or you haven't got a chance of getting that, there's not really much point thinking about it, which maybe feels quite bad, but there's no shame in, not being the top 1% in something. There's loads of other ways to prove yourself. So Oxford and Cambridge usually have a few fairly unique aspects which only really apply to them. I mentioned right at the start that as it stands, the timeline is a little bit earlier for Oxford and Cambridge. So one thing is, we mentioned maybe the top 20 need maths, but pretty much, they might not say it's essential, but pretty much Oxford and Cambridge need further maths. This screenshot is from the Oxford website. 97% of their people who got places took further maths. And I'm sure those 3% went to a school which didn't offer it. So if you're in those shoes and it isn't available to you, you might be a slight exception. Make sure that's in your reference. But if your school does further maths and you don't do it, it's going to be difficult. And I've got to say, I was in this exact situation. So I applied to Oxford. I didn't go to Oxford. And my school did offer further maths and I didn't take it. I ended up kind of half taking it to AS, which was just a year 12 only qualification. But it wasn't enough for me. It sure wasn't the only factor, but it's almost a non-starter, I think, in most cases. Another complication is you need to have an application to a specific college, and the colleges have got different rules and different atmospheres and pros and cons. So that's another layer of research. And some colleges are extremely strict and might only let in 1 or 2 students for computer science, and other ones may be a little bit more lenient, although still very strict. And so that research is something else to be doing. Another bit which I fell short at, I'm sure, is the entrance test. So currently both Oxford and Cambridge have an entrance test, which currently is done in October and early November, I think. So this test is pretty much bespoke to them. Here is the Oxford MAT entrance test specification, which is pretty much just A-level maths as far as I know, although some tricky bits of it, and the questions are not A-level maths questions. They are the same topics but framed in a more tricky way. As you would expect, right? This is an elite university. Now this graph is, I found this graph on my computer back when I was doing this, because I sat the MAT, the MAT. Basically it shows you that if you don't do well in this entrance test, very, very unlikely you're going to even get an interview. So shortlisted is getting an interview, which is the step afterwards usually, and very few were given interviews, but also very few, unless they were scoring extremely highly, got offers in the end. So you've kind of got to be quite good at 2 things. The interviews I never experienced because I didn't get that far, so you'd have to do further research, but as far as I know, they test you on problem solving and things like that, so it is quite a high level of scrutiny. So they are very, very competitive. It's why, while you definitely should be ambitious and definitely should think about it if you're in that general grade range, you don't want to be arrogant and assume you're going to get there. You don't want to be totally fixed in your mindset if you're going to get there, because the reality is, according to Oxford, only around 5% of applicants end up getting an offer, let alone actually getting in, right? You might get an offer and not meet those requirements. So it is tricky. 100% worth going for. I don't regret going for it. I just wasn't quite good enough in that year. Didn't have further maths, and honestly my maths wasn't good enough anyway to ace the MAT. So definitely worth thinking about, definitely worth doing some more research, but it's another layer of complication which other universities don't have. So once you've done the open days and you've done your research and you've hopefully got a list of, say, 8, 9, 10 universities which are options for you, maybe you haven't visited all of them, but you've got at least 5 which you've been to and thought about heavily, you've got to choose the final 5, which will be either before October or before January, depending on whether you're going for Oxbridge or not. And of course you've got to weigh up pros and cons of all of the ones you're looking at. Don't apply just because you visited. For example, I applied to one university which I visited, and I didn't like the visit at all. I felt very depressed at the university. Now, it was dark and wet, and the buildings were very old-fashioned, and I wasn't getting a great sense from it. The computer science department was miles away from everything else. I wasn't getting a good sense. But because I hadn't visited a sixth university, I applied for it anyway, and it was a bit of a waste of time. So you might want to do virtual visits or just watch some videos on YouTube if there are some. If you didn't like the visit, don't apply for it, is what I'm trying to say. Now, for your final 5, I would definitely try and choose across the range if you're able to. So especially if you're going for Oxford or Cambridge, or the top 5, pick one of those, so an ambitious one, but it's got to be in the range of your likely predicted grades. If your teacher's predicted you A star, AA, go through the ambitious one because they might reduce it. You might be able to persuade a teacher to increase their predicted grade for one of them. But if you're predicted BBB and this ambitious one is AAA, that might be a little bit too far. But discuss with your teacher maybe. Then pick 2 or 3 possible firm choices, ones which would be your first choice, ones which are roughly what your predicted grades are right now and things, and you feel you could get in if the year goes well. Then 2 possible insurance choices. The insurance are the backups. So make sure you've done research in all 5 you're going for, and full research, and ideally you visited. That's what we want in an ideal world. And if by the time you get to January you're a bit undecided on a few things, like where you want to go in the country, try and pick some variety. If you pick 5 London universities and you decide that actually that's not what you want, well, you're obviously in trouble. Whereas if you pick a couple of different options, ideally you get offers from all of them or some of them, and you get to choose later on. So leave some variety unless you are fixed in your choices. And one small thing which comes up sometimes is if universities don't know who else you've applied to, if you apply in October, I think they're going to assume you've applied to Oxford or Cambridge, but they don't know ultimately, so you don't need to be strategic or think too closely about that. They're just 5 options. Hopefully you'll get 5 offers, but few people do. Most maybe get 2 or 3. Now, once you get to springtime, usually in year 13, if you're doing this from school, you then do your reply, which is when you actually accept offers. So wait till all of them come in. Don't jump the gun. You don't get 2 and suddenly start doing this, just in case you get more and just in case you change your mind. But try and make this choice as soon as you can, though. When I say ASAP, I don't mean like tonight. You get all offers and you make a choice tonight. But I don't mean delay it for 2 months, because actually the deadline from UCAS is generally quite late in the year. But you thinking about it all that time and kind of going backwards and forwards and umming and ahhing is not what you need. You need to make a choice, stick to it, focus on the exams, otherwise you won't get there. Then you've got to choose, I've used these words already, but a firm offer and an insurance offer. A firm offer is your first choice, and it must be your first choice because if you meet the grades for your firm offer, you're going there. So you can't decide on results day which one you want to go to. Your firm offer is where you're going unless you don't meet the grades. So don't just pick a firm which needs the highest grades, pick the one you want to go to. So if there is a university which you want to go to, but you've got an offer which is higher, put as a firm the one you want to go to, no matter if you've got higher offers. It's ultimately what you want to do, right? So insurance is only there if you get to results day and you don't meet the requirements for your firm choice. And I would suggest, from experience actually, that probably best if this insurance allows slip-ups in 2 subjects or by 2 grades in 1 subject. So for example, if your firm offer is A star, A star, A, that's a very, very high offer by the way, but let's say it was, well, probably best if your insurance offer is AAA, because that's a slip up in 2 subjects, or it's A star B, or A star A B, something along those lines, right, where you've got a bit of leeway but not too much, right? I don't think you want to be too low, because if you really have a nightmare with your A levels, you can always go through clearing or retake the year or something like that. So really important that you are happy with your insurance. Don't just pick a really low entry requirement just as a backup, because that's a little bit unambitious, I would say. Now you could well be going there, and I know this from experience because I went to my insurance offer. I applied for Oxford, didn't get into Oxford, which did hit me not too hard, but was a bit of a kind of it felt like a bit of an insult at the time. You know, I was kind of trained by my school to think, right, I'm getting 3 A stars here, I'm going to be going to Oxford. And when you don't get in, it's a bit tricky. But my firm offer was 3 A's, so quite a lot lower than 3 A stars. And I ended up getting AAB. I had a couple of physics exams which went really badly, mostly down to lack of preparation, maybe a slight aspect of me giving up a tiny bit towards the end. Not great at the time. When you wake up on results day and check your phone and see you've got into your insurance, you know that you've not done particularly well at your A-levels, was not a great day in my life. But obviously as an adult, many years on, it just feels like a bit of a bump in the road. And as a teacher, it's a great story because, of course, people do get into their insurance because things don't always go exactly to plan. But to be honest, because maybe I wasn't arrogant necessarily, but because I was so focused on my firm offer and even higher than what I ended up getting an offer for, I didn't really think about my insurance at all. I did visit my insurance, which the open day itself I didn't enjoy at all. I was in a bit of a bad mood, I think. Tried to go home quite quickly. I wasn't really looking around because probably at the time I was thinking, I'm not going to go here. I'm just visiting to be on the safe side. So when I got to results day in year 13 and realised I'm going to this university, it was a bit of a, oh my goodness, I don't know anything about this place. It's suddenly I'm going to be here next month. So even if you are very confident in yourself and back yourself as you should, make sure the insurance is one you are happy with and you know about, just so you've got that peace of mind. But again, like, if things go badly, you've got clearing and you can retake the year, do a gap year. I didn't even consider that really at the time, but it's an option open to you if you need to. And, you know, as I talked about in my other video where I went through some of the details of university, while it's not great all the time, my insurance turned out to be absolutely fine. I was very happy there. I wasn't, much better than everybody else. I was, there are people much smarter than me on my course, despite me kind of almost going to a so-called better university. So it's not the end of the world if you don't go to the place which seems ideal. Now, I think just to end with some top tips, as I usually do in these sort of videos, which I've maybe tried to mention most of these already, but the first point I think is relevant as you get towards the end of year 12, early year 13, is to try and ignore the noise around you and focus on yourself, focus on your future. By that I mean your friends are going to be talking about stuff, or just people in your class are going to be talking about stuff, talking about the course they want to do. Some will be really definitive that they're absolutely going to this university, absolutely doing this course, and trying to persuade you why that's the best option. Equally, there might be people who don't want to go to university and are being quite negative about it and trying to put you off, trying to say, oh, I've got this job at this great company, I'm doing this apprenticeship. And it might be great, but it may not be. You've got to focus on you. Don't follow the crowd. Try and think for yourself. Don't be the person who just sort of sleepwalks into going to university because they just followed everybody else. That's not a good way to enter a really important period in your life. I think for some people the trickiest bit regarding this noise is when offers start to come in and people start to brag about it maybe. People don't, announce when they haven't got an offer. They might announce when they do have an offer. But that's when it can be a bit tricky and comparisons get made. It's easier said than done, but do try and ignore this if you are able to. I mentioned earlier that it took me, I think, between a couple of weeks to a couple of months to get all 4 offers I ended up getting. And in hindsight, that was a bit of dead time. It felt a bit like I was in limbo and was just waiting to hear the offers. But it shouldn't be dead time. It should be you studying. It should be you getting ready for your A-levels. So please try and avoid falling into the trap I did of just sort of being so focused on the university application that actually I let the rest of year 13 pass by when that was what was more important. I've mentioned visits before, and I've mentioned that not every visit I went to was what I wanted. But try and make the most of those. Take those photos and plan stuff in advance so they're not just a day walking around, getting tired, getting bored. And like I say, have an insurance choice you know and are happy with. You should not be thinking about it as much as your firm choice, because if you sort of talk yourself into the idea that your insurance is better than your firm choice, that's probably not a great mindset to get into. But don't do what I did, which is just completely ignore it and then be shocked when it unfortunately became very relevant for me. And the final thing, which I didn't fully adhere to, I did mostly, is to focus on the exams. There are so many distractions in year 13, and the university application can be such a big distraction. But the exams are how you're going to get to university. You might have an amazing offer from an amazing university, but it's an offer. Most are conditional on you getting the grades. So that's why if you can get stuff done early, do your research in year 12, we don't want it to drag into much of year 13 if possible, because the exams are what is going to be important. So I really hope that was useful, or at least bits of it were, depending on what you know already. And if you do go through this process, I really hope it goes well and you get out of it what you are looking for.